spirit.
Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy explores the social context of black-white relationships in his new book, Interracial Intimacies. This talk from the Margaret Mitchell House and Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, is an hour and 20 minutes.
Hey, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Margaret Mitchell House. My name is Donna Buzzard, and I'm the Director of Programming here. We are honored this evening to host Professor Randall Kennedy. With all the blizzards up north, I don't really know how you're getting home, Dr. Kennedy, but we're awfully glad that you're here. I have to say that this is my proudest moment since I came to the Margaret Mitchell House. I've gotten some questions over the past few weeks about why we would hold such an event. And the main reason we would, as part of our mission, is to bring people together of diverse points of view and opinions and give them a forum to talk. And that's the biggest reason for having Dr. Kennedy here. I would also ask, we're better than the Margaret Mitchell House to attempt to knit together visions of the Old South and the New South. There are also some literary reasons for hosting Professor Kennedy, reasons that relate to Margaret Mitchell. There have surely been interracial intimacies since we invented the concept of race, and there is scholarship to support that Margaret Mitchell considered these issues herself. No less of a Southern historian than Joel Williamson of UNC Chapel Hill has theorized that the physical descriptions of Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind have a decidedly African-American cast to them. And she also wrote a novella called Roper Carmigan that it's been destroyed, but it was said to have contained an interracial romance in it. These are not new issues for the world, for the South, or for Margaret Mitchell. And then there's the purest of academic reasons, the outstanding scholarship of Professor Kennedy. His resume is staggering. He went to Princeton undergrad, Yale Law School, he's a Rhodes Scholar, he clerked under Thurgood Marshall, and he's faculty at Harvard Law. He wrote Race, Crime, and the Law, and last year released Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word. Troublesome indeed. Such a volatile word that one leaps to the end of the title so you can express the explanation of why you're saying it. When I placed the order for the book at Random House, I ordered it by an item number. And the very sweet young woman who at the end of it was doing the customer service and telling me, okay, you ordered 100 copies of, and there was a long pause. And there was another pause, and then she finally went, Nigger? I was like, yes, that's the book. That's really a powerful word. He comes to us with a brand new book, Interracial Intimacies, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption. And frankly, I think there's no better city in the nation better equipped than Atlanta for seeking a better day for multiracial living. And that's really the point of his new book. I would like to thank C-SPAN for coming to tape our lecture tonight. I would ask you to please keep your noise during the event to a minimum. And during the Q&A section, I'll be circulating with a handheld mic. If you would please be patient and wait for me to come around so that you can speak into the microphone during the Q&A session, that would be a big help. Finally, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum and the Martin Luther King National Historic Site. Without further delay, please welcome Professor Randall Kennedy.
Thanks so much for the generous introduction and even more for this wonderful gathering, this opportunity to share ideas. I'm going to spend some time on an opening presentation describing my book, Interracial Intimacies. And then I'm going to open up the floor for questions, for comments, and by all means for any objections that anyone might have. My book is about people who have crossed the race line for purposes of friendship, for purposes of sex, for purposes of marriage, for purposes of adoption. It's about people crossing the race line for interracial intimacy, and it's about the various obstacles that they have faced. So in the book, we encounter people like Nell Butler and Negro Charles. This was a couple who in 1681 got married, even though Nell Butler was a white indentured servant, Negro Charles was a slave. And under Maryland law at that time, a white woman who married a black slave would herself become enslaved for the lifetime of the husband, and their children were subjected to permanent enslavement. Notwithstanding that rather heavy discouragement, Nell Butler and Negro Charles got married. The third Lord Baltimore tried to dissuade Nell Butler from getting married and telling her about the law, and she is reputed to have said that she would rather marry Negro Charles than Lord Baltimore himself. We also encounter people like Ralph Quarles and Lucy Langston. Ralph Quarles was a Revolutionary War hero. He was a plantation owner. He acquired Lucy Langston as a slave, as she was the payment for a debt that was owed to him. They had a long relationship. She bore him 4 children. He emancipated her, he emancipated the children, he took financial responsibility for the children. When they died, they were buried side by side as he requested in his will. Little side note here, the youngest of their children was John Mercer Langston, who was the founding dean of the Howard University Law School and was also a member of the House of Representatives. He represented the state of Virginia for a good long time. Now, in the age of slavery, of course, most interracial sex between blacks and whites, or at least between white men and black women, was coercive. It was a function of intimidation, of exploitation, of rape. But then you do come across other sorts of relationships. So you come across a former slave owner in Mississippi who immediately after the Civil War insisted upon marrying the woman who had been his mistress. She had been one of his slaves. She was his mistress. Right after the Civil War, he insists upon marrying her. And in explaining this to an army chaplain, he says that he had already married her in the sight of God. And he does this, of course, even in the face of tremendous ostracism in his community. Around the same time, one encounters in this state Carrie Hall, a white woman, and Sandy Hall, a black man. I came across this relationship in a letter in correspondence contained in the Freedmen's Bureau files. Carrie Hall wrote a letter to the Freedmen's Bureau in which she said that she was very much attached to this colored gentleman, that she wished to marry him, and that they would be the happiest couple on earth if it weren't for threats that they had to encounter and had to suffer from whites. And they asked for assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau. Let's move the story up 90 years, and let's stay in the state of Georgia. One encounters people like Charlene Hunter Galt and Walter Stovall. Some of you may remember that Charlene Hunter was desegregated at the University of Georgia. While she was a student at the University of Georgia, she became romantically involved with Walter Stovall. They eloped. They got married secretly. When word leaked out, there was a lot of commotion about it, commotion that they knew they would encounter, undoubtedly. Georgia's governor stated that their marriage was a shame and a disgrace. Her parents expressed disappointment in this relationship. His parents told Time magazine that this was, quote, the end of the world, end quote. Neighbors of the Stovall's agreed because neighbors would stop by their house to offer condolences. They had to leave the state, actually, in order to avoid prosecution, because when they got married out of state, it was still illegal in the state of Georgia for blacks and whites to marry. So people through the course of American history have had to brook all manner of impediments to interracial intimacy. They've had to brook the threat of criminal prosecution. They've had to face ostracism from their communities, white community, black community. They've had to face the disfavor of parents and brothers and sisters and of friends. But regardless of that, people have, throughout American history, crossed the race line in search of companionship. And in my book, I detail many of these relationships and many of the difficulties that people have faced. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases in my book. There's one, though, that I want to focus on, and I'm going to focus on before subsiding and taking questions and comments and carrying the conversation the way that you'd like for the conversation to go. I start off my book with a case that I came across early on in the research, and it's been a haunting case ever since. And I thought that this was a case that actually touched upon many of the themes, many of the issues, many of the difficulties that I wanted to illuminate in my pages. The case I have in mind arose in Louisiana in the early 1950s. Be more precise, in 1952, a white woman gave birth to a child in Louisiana. As soon as she gave birth to this child, she was overcome by a stroke, which left her paralyzed, left her speechless. Her sister said that she would raise the child because it was quite clear that the woman who had given birth would really never be able to raise the child. So her sister says, "I'll take the child home and raise the child as my own." The sister does take the child home. And initially, everything is proceeding fine. But then there's a problem. What's the problem? The problem is that the child starts turning darker day by day. This is 1952 in Louisiana. When this lady starts walking the child around, neighbors come to her and start complaining. Let me read you one particular complaint. Neighbors complained that, quote, "the child possibly was a nigger," end quote. This aunt who was raising the child had 7 children of her own. And as time went by, she determined that she would not be able to raise her sister's child. So she took the child back to the New Orleans authorities and surrendered the child, abandoned the child. The New Orleans authorities took the child and attempted to get a home. A black couple, a couple named the Greens, they'd been married a while. They weren't able to have biological children. They said, "Well, we've been thinking about adopting a child. Why don't you let us take this child home, see how we like it, and let's see how things work out." They take the child home. They fall in love with the child, and the Greens say, "We'd like to adopt this child." The New Orleans authorities say, "Fine, great," and they proceed with the arrangements, but then another problem arises. What's that problem? The problem is that when this child was born, white was stamped on the child's birth certificate. Louisiana had a law expressly prohibiting adoption across the race line. And this was actually a rather unusual law because in most Jim Crow states, there were no laws prohibiting adoption across the race line. Of course, there were laws prohibiting all sorts of things, adoption in the same, blacks and whites being buried in the same cemetery, blacks and whites sitting together in school, blacks and whites drinking from the same water fountain. Jim Crow tried to separate everything. But I think that most Jim Crow states did not have laws prohibiting interracial adoption because that was thought to be such a far out, wild, implausible thing that legislatures said, well, why do we have to, we shouldn't outlaw that. That's so crazy that we don't have to outlaw it. Louisiana, of course, was especially punctilious, however, when it came to Jim Crow. So Louisiana did outlaw interracial adoption. So the Greens were told this is a real problem. The Greens responded by saying, we can deal with this. We can deal with this. What let's do is let's change the child's birth certificate. The reason why we're in this fix in the first place is because it's quite clear that the biological father was a Negro. So let's just change the birth certificate. Problem is that under Louisiana law, to change the race on someone's birth certificate was a real big deal. You had to have proof beyond all doubt, not proof beyond reasonable doubt. You had to have proof beyond all doubt as to the lineage of the person. And the figure who was in charge of racial categorization in Louisiana, the person who was in charge of keeping in close check who was black and who was white, was a person by the name of Naomi Drake, who was completely obsessed by racial categories. And her position was, we don't know who the biological father is, so we're not going to change the birth certificate. The Greens responded by going to an attorney. They went to an attorney and said, well, we're going to sue the state of Louisiana about this, and we want a judge to overturn the decision of the Bureau of Vital Statistics. This lawyer was a very established lawyer. He took the case but immediately gave it to a young associate who actually had never tried a case before. And he handed this case over to the young associate. The young associate takes the case, goes to the Greens, and really fights hard to have this birth certificate changed. They indeed go to court. The young lawyer hires an anthropologist from Tulane University who examines this little child. What sort of examination? Well, the anthropologist takes a look at the hair of the child to examine the curliness, measures the width of the nose, measures the thickness of the lips, takes a look at the fingernails. There was this idea that black people had a special sign. No, this is true. There was black people were said to have a special half moon at the bottom of their fingernails. Well, take a look. The anthropologist examined the child's foot and legs because there was thought to be a special curvature to black people's feet. It was the notion, the Negro foot. The anthropologist went on the stand and he said that he was quite sure that the biological father was a Negro. The judge said, are you completely sure? He said, no, I'm not completely sure, but I'm quite sure. In a minute, you'll see why that hesitation, that qualification turned out to be very important. The lawyer for the Greens also put on the stand a man by the name of Stanton. His nickname was Rock Stanton. Why was Rock Stanton put on brought to trial and put on the stand pursuant to a subpoena? Well, the lawyer, this young lawyer, found some love letters written to the biological mother of the child by one Rock Stanton. Rock Stanton was a black man. He was subpoenaed, he was put on the stand, and he said that yes, it's true that he had written these letters, but no, he definitely had not been intimate with this woman. Now, not only did the lawyer have these love letters, but there was also something else that happened during this trial. During the first day of testimony, Rock Stanton was looking for a restroom. He could not go to the toilet in the courthouse because there was no toilet for black people in the courthouse. The courthouse was in the middle of the French Quarter. He had to leave the courthouse to try to find a toilet. Well, at the very moment that he left the courthouse to find a toilet, there was somebody else who was in the same predicament. Who was that somebody else? None other than Mr. Green, the man who was attempting to change the birth certificate. They talk about how they're both looking for a restroom. They both either look for a restroom, and during this sojourn, Rock Stanton spills the beans and says, well, yeah, I was intimate with this woman, etc. Green comes back, tells the attorney, but of course, when Stanton is on the stand, he denies it. Why did he deny it? Why was he so adamant about denying it? No one knows for sure, but the most plausible reason is that he was afraid. After all, this was early 1950s Louisiana. He was in the middle of the French Quarter, where, as I understand it, in those times, black people weren't allowed unless they were just there to work. He was in the middle of this courthouse, and he was completely frightened. And so the last thing he was going to do was admit that he had had an intimate sexual relationship with this white woman. End of testimony, the judges decide that they will not overrule the Bureau of Vital Statistics. And one of the things that the judges say is, we don't know for sure. It looks as though it's very likely that the biological father was a black man, but we don't know for sure, and therefore we're not going to change the birth certificate. The Greens, therefore, are not allowed to adopt this child. The child is taken back by authorities and put in an orphanage. Question, what sort of orphanage do you think this child was put in? Do you think that this child, who, by the way, is legally a white person, do you think that she was put in a white orphanage? Answer, no. Through special dispensation, she is put into a colored orphanage. She is sent to a colored school. Now, initially, all I read in the law reports, the report of the Louisiana Court of Appeals, was the decision that the judges came to affirming the judgment of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Louisiana. So all I read initially was this court case where this little girl, about my age, had been consigned to this limbo in Louisiana. She had these people who wanted to love her, wanted to adopt her. They were not allowed to. She was legally a white person, but in fact, she was in an orphanage for colored orphans. And so I had this just terrible sinking feeling, this horrible case. I read the case, put it in the drawer, read other cases, but this one really haunted me. And one day I took this case out, and I thought, well, maybe there's some people in Louisiana who remember this case. Maybe let me backtrack. Let me see if I can find out more about this. I called the attorney who had represented the Greens. And I call and I get this guy on the phone. And he said, my goodness, I haven't talked with anybody about this case in years. In fact, I've never talked with anybody about this case. And he was very excited to talk with me about it. He sent me the next day the records of the case, the briefs in the case. And we talked a good bit about the background of the case and the cast of characters involved. Through his good offices, I was able to get in touch with the social worker who had presided over the case. And through a little bit more digging, I was able to get in touch with Mrs. Green, who's an elderly lady now, but I had a very nice, spent the day with her, talking about her and her husband and the difficulties they had faced. And then with a little bit more digging, I was able to find the little girl, who's now a grown-up woman, who lives in New Orleans. And let me tell you a little bit about the part of the case that's beyond the law reports. After this little girl was consigned to limbo, legal limbo in Louisiana, Jet magazine did an article about her, put on the cover the following title: "The Orphan in Dixie whom white people don't want and whom black people are not allowed to adopt." And then then you turn inside and they had a big picture of her and the story of the case. Well, a black journalist by the name of Roy Ottley, very distinguished journalist. He was a columnist for the Chicago Tribune and other papers. He read about this, and he and his wife decided that they would try to get this child out of Louisiana, and if they could, that they would adopt this child. So he goes down to Louisiana, and somehow, it's not altogether clear how, but somehow he convinces the Louisiana authorities to let the child out of the state. The child is let out of the state. They take her back to Chicago and they adopt her and raise her. She went to college. She's had a good life. She went to college at Fisk University. She has children of her own. She's lived a good life, and I had the good fortune to meet her. And so this story that begins in such a tortured way, that shows the base side, the ugly side of American obsession with race and racial difference, ultimately did have an ending that was not altogether tragic. And in any event, I begin my book with this case because so much of what my book is about is encapsulated in this case. On the one hand, the question, the shame, the anxiety, the sense of threat that has surrounded interracial intimacy, the relationship between this woman and this man, Rock Stanton, afraid to even say that he'd been intimate with this woman. The whole question of what does race mean anyway? How can we tell who's white and who's black? How do you tell that? That is embedded in this case. The questions regarding adoption and the struggle over adoption, a struggle over interracial adoption, a struggle that is still very contentious and still leads to litigation. That is involved in this case. So many of the things that I touch upon are involved in this case, and I thought that it would be a good way to begin my book. I've now given you something of a sense of the coverage of the book. And like I said, let's continue, but let's continue through a dialogue. And before I cede the floor over, let me just say how appreciative I am of being here with you. I thank you for your attentiveness. And now for questions, comments, or objections. Thank you very much.
If you could raise your hand.
Out of all of the subjects out there, why a book about interracial relationships?
Yeah. Couple of reasons. The question was, why a book about interracial relationships? There are a variety of reasons. One is, I think that interracial intimacy, these sorts of relationships with which I'm most concerned, friendships, sexual relationships, marital relationships, familial relationships, are understudied. I teach at a law school. I teach at Harvard Law School. I teach a course on race relations law. In such a course, people expect for you to spend a long time talking about the law, the regulation of race at the workplace, the regulation of race with respect to housing markets, the regulation of race with respect to education. Spend a lot of time on that. People don't think about spending a lot of time on the regulation of race with respect to marital intimacy, sexual intimacy. Though if you think about it, if you think about how people get jobs, if you think about how people conceive of themselves, if you think about how people learn about the world, these sorts of relationships are incredibly important. Friendship as an institution, dating as an institution is incredibly important. And one thing that drew me to this subject was the extent to which people actually did not talk about it and actually thought of these sorts of relationships as being rather trivial. Let me give you an episode that further sort of made me really determined to investigate this subject. I was teaching my course on race relations law. We were talking about affirmative action, and a student said that he thought that the drawing of any racial distinctions, the drawing of all racial distinctions is immoral. Not just illegal, immoral. And he was very fervent about that. And I said, okay, let's test out your proposition. So if you had a friend, I said, if you had a friend who was lonely and seeking companionship, and your friend put in a personals ad, let's make your friend a white guy. Let's say this white guy says, I'm a white guy, I'm looking for a white woman who likes volleyball, and let's say heavy metal music, and some other things. Race is one of the things that he puts in there. I asked the student, I said, well, does this mean that you would think that your friend had done something immoral by putting race in his personals ad? The student did not say anything in response. And then I said, well, what about others on this? I mean, the proposition was just put that the drawing of racial distinctions is always a bad thing. And now I'm just testing out the proposition by asking about what about in this realm? Dating. We had been having a very vigorous conversation, very vigorous debate. Thing went completely mute. And I said, actually, afterwards, I think actually upon thinking about this might be a very interesting topic. I've never seen anybody write about personals ads and the drawing of racial distinctions in personals ads. This is people, everybody's familiar with personals ads. People think about personals ads. Personals ads, it seems to me, are rather important. They're rather interesting datum. One student did write an article, actually. She wrote an article in the Harvard Law Review called Racial Surfing in the Romantic Marketplace. I'm sure it's one of the few, it's probably the only Harvard Law Review article that has subsequently been profiled in Cosmopolitan magazine. And I remembered her article as I was actually pursuing my subject, there was one thing that I suggested to the student that she did not do. I suggested that she write to people who used racial or ethnic or religious signifiers in their personals ads, and just write in a completely non-judgmental way. Just ask, why are you looking for these sorts of markings? I mean, what's your thinking? She didn't do it, but for 3 years I did it. For 3 years I would write every week, or every month, depending on the frequency of the publication. I would write to people. And most people, I'm sure, just threw my letter into the garbage. But there were, over 3 years, a substantial number of people who wrote back and gave me an answer. But again, to get back to your question, why this subject, it's a very important subject that, looked at as an institution, is actually more important socially, in its social consequences, than some of the other institutions upon which we focus much more time. There's another thing, too. This area has generated a lot of law. It's a law that has been forgotten about. But once I started reading the cases are just extraordinary. I mean, it's one movie, one melodrama, one novel after another once you really get deep into these cases. So just from a pure human interest point of view, the subject is just fascinating. I mean, it's poignant, it's often heartbreaking, sometimes it's very inspiring. But once I got into it, it just sort of dragged me along. Those are some of the reasons why I invested the time in exploring this subject.
Well, thank you for coming to Atlanta. My question kind of takes, can you hear me? My question takes a kind of a different spin. I'm a first-generation Latino, and as you know, the last census showed that we are the largest, quote-unquote, minority. When I go to where my family's from, Colombia, I'm considered the American cousin. When I come to America, I'm the Latino. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I'm curious as I go out there and talk to folks and things, and right now Latino is kind of in vogue, is, finding a definition of what is it to be Latino? What is it to be this new minority group? We come in all shades of the rainbow. What is it that binds us? It's not necessarily language. It's not necessarily culture. It's not necessarily race. So how is it that we're able to kind of create an identity, and not only in the economic and business world, but in the political world? And how is it that we are able to emerge and succeed in this new paradigm where everyone is so sensitive to differences within different groups?
Mm-hmm. History will tell us. There is no, you use the operative word, how will we create? Latino identity, Latino consciousness, group consciousness, will be created over time in the crucible of various decisions, the crucible of various struggles. Over the course of American history, the whole conception of race has been one continuous act of creation and recreation. The whole idea of who is black and who is white, for instance, has changed dramatically over time. Who's Latino will undoubtedly change over time. Let me give you one example. Let's go to the Commonwealth of Virginia. I pick on the Commonwealth of Virginia for a number of reasons. One, the Commonwealth of Virginia was the site of undoubtedly the most famous case in my book, undoubtedly the most aptly titled case in all of American constitutional law. The name of the case is Loving versus the Commonwealth of Virginia. That was the 1967 case in which the Supreme Court of the United States belatedly invalidated state laws prohibiting interracial marriage. In Virginia, until 1910, one was legally white so long as one was not more than 24% black. Nowadays, people think of, that America has been governed by the so-called one-drop rule. Any discernible sign of African American lineage made one African American. In many jurisdictions, that's simply not true, and Virginia is one. Now, remember my statistic, one was legally white so long as you were not more than 24% black. In 1924, Virginia changed its law. In 1924, Virginia enacted the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 said that if you had any discernible African American lineage, you were black. What did that mean? That meant that in Virginia, you could be a white person in 1900, but a colored person in 1925. Oh, and this was a big issue. In fact, during the floor debate in 1924, there was one representative in Virginia who jumped to his feet and said the following. He said, if we keep messing around in here, there are not going to be any more white people left in Virginia. And he had a good point for two reasons. Reason number one, obviously, there had been a lot of interracial intimacy. And number two, he was aware that the whole conception of who's black and who's white, we create those determinations. Some of those interesting cases that I came across in my book had to do with trials. Just like the adoption case, is the little girl black? Is she white? Well, there were other trials that would take place. Let me give you an example of how a trial would come about. Let's imagine, let's imagine the following. Let's imagine that a couple was charged with violating a state law prohibiting interracial marriage. Couple's charged with violating this law. What's the couple's defense? A couple's defense might be, we're not in violation of this law. We're both colored. The prosecuting attorney says, this woman isn't colored. She's white. The defense says, no, she's colored. How do you tell? There were trials about that, in which, again, people's hair texture would be looked at. Do you remember the advertisement on television, only your hairdresser knows for sure? Hairdressers would be called in. There would be trials with respect to race. And these trials would take place in criminal settings. Sometimes they didn't take place in criminal settings. The laws prohibiting marriage across the race line were also enforced by private parties. Let me give you an example of how this would come up. Imagine a wealthy white man. Wealthy white man dies. He leaves his estate to his wife. He dies, of course, the estate goes to her. The white man's brothers and sisters are a little bit angry because, after all, he's wealthy, he leaves this big estate. If the wife wasn't in the picture, they'd have the estate. They hire a private investigator to take a look into the lineage of the wife. They find that the wife had a colored grandmother. They then challenge her legitimate right to the estate, because in that state it's against the law for white people to be married to black people. The claim is that she's actually black. The claim is, therefore, that this couple was never legally married. Therefore, the brother and sister should get the estate, not the putative widow. I detail dozens of cases like that. It would also come up, by the way, in the context of divorce. White man's married to white woman, so everybody thinks. He gets tired of the woman, he wants to get rid of her and not pay alimony. He gets a private investigator, says, I thought my wife was white. She's actually colored. I want the marriage to be annulled. Now here I came across an interesting thing. Most judges would not permit that. Thoroughly white supremacist, thoroughly white separatist judges would not go for that. Essentially, they would say, this is too much for me. They would. They would say, this guy is just too much of a cad. And they would figure out some way to repudiate the claim made by the man. But again, the point is, getting back to your question about, Latino, what does that mean? The question of who's white, who's black, has been in flux throughout American life, though we've repressed it. And one way we repress it is to use the shorthand black-white. And the fact of the matter is, people say we're becoming a multiracial society. Are you kidding? We've been a multiracial society. Latino people, themselves thoroughly multiracial, for a long time been interacting with Native American people, African American people, Euro-American people. We are already interrelated. We're already thoroughly multiracial. It's just that we repress it, and we use shorthand expressions like white and black to cover up the complexity of American life. And one of the aims of my book is to really excavate and to show the extent to which we've been, for a long time, a thoroughly multiracial society.
For fear of seeming absurd, I would ask you if you think I'm black or white or which one, but actually my real question is, are there any women of color who are tenured today as we speak at Harvard Law School?
Yes.
Approximately how many?
One, Lonnie Guinier.
Okay, because I ask because I'm sure you're familiar with Derek Bell.
Very, very much so.
Who went on leave about 10 to 12 years ago precisely because there were no women of color tenured at Harvard Law School.
That's true.
Thank you.
My question basically revolves around the government and its involvement with determining who's black, who's white, who's Latino. Do you think we'll ever get to the point where, when it comes to counting people and how monies are divided up to help communities to do whatever they need with programming to improve schools and hospitals and that sort of thing, that it will become a non-issue where the money will just be out there and you can use it to the best benefit of a community?
I think that for the foreseeable future, racial classification, for all of its ambiguity and for all of the dissatisfactory aspects of it, for the foreseeable future, it will be with us. And I hope it is with us in the following sense. It is important for Americans to know what's going on in their society. And while on the one hand, I'm thoroughly in favor of self-identification, I do not think that the government should be able to come up to someone and say, you are this or you are that. I think rather the government should ask people, what do you consider yourself? And that should do it. If somebody says in good faith, I'm black, I'm white, I'm Latino, I'm what have you, I think that should be determinative. I do not think it would be a good idea to just wipe out the boxes and just wipe out the effort to keep some sort of tabs on the racial demographics of American life, because it's very useful to know what's happening in America with respect to things like the distribution of wealth, the distribution of income, the distribution of health care, There are societies which are quite handicapped because actually they don't have any good way of understanding themselves. So there are downsides to racial categorization, but in my view, the upside of knowledge with the categories that we have, and also keeping in mind that, as far as I'm concerned, we should also be open to the creation of new categories. I think that information is useful for us to have, and I think that that will be with us for the foreseeable future.
I'd like to say first, thank you so much for being here. It's a very interesting discussion. And not a question, but just a comment. A week or so ago, I had a license plate tag stolen from my car, and so I called to make a report. And it's a report here in Atlanta that you make over the phone. And I was talking to the officer, an Officer Schley, and he asked me my name and my address, and then he asked me my race. And I said, well, I'm black and Jewish. And he said, well, I'm really sorry, we don't have that. I said, well, I'm not ordering, you know, French fries here. I said, well, what do you have? And he said, well, it's kind of complicated. I said, well, just read to me what you have. Do you have a blank space, and can you just put that in? Well, why don't you just mark 2 boxes? No, I'm sorry, we just can't do that. He said, well, let me ask you something. If I saw you on the street, what would I think you were? I said, probably Hispanic. He said, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to mark it unknown and just come in to pick up your report, and we'll see you when you get here. And, you know, so I say that just to say that I think it is an interesting discussion, and I wholeheartedly agree with you that people really certainly should be allowed to define themselves. And my mother always encouraged that. And to your point, just regarding data keeping, when we're filling out the census information, there was one year, and my mother's Jewish and my grandparents are Ukrainian Jews. She marked that she was an African Jew. My brother, sister, and I each marked different things, and I was worried that we were going to be audited by the Census Bureau but we had grown up in the spirit of defining ourselves and being comfortable with that and not allowing anyone else to define us or put us into boxes or categories.
Thank you for your comment.
I would like to ask you about the DNA now. How is that used to define what a person is? And also, what would be your take on the current situation involved with the Jefferson and Sally Hemings dispute as far as the cemetery goes, and the other issues involved with the Jefferson Society and all the dispute about that?
With respect to the first question about DNA, I'm not a scientist. Of course, I read about the Human Genome Project, and the more and more one reads about it, the more and more it seems as though the leading scientists emphasize over and over again the superficiality of the differences to which we in our society attach such importance. The fact of the matter is that actually for a long time, since World War II, scientists have been saying much the same thing that the leaders of the Human Genome Project are saying, but perception matters. Regardless of what scientists say, millions of people in the street have a perception of their fellows. You walk down the street and somebody thinks that you are Latino, or that you are black, or you are white, or so whatever they think, and then they act accordingly. And regardless of what science says about their perception has a certain sort of force to it. And when I write about race in my book, I have a really conventional definition of race. It's not as if I say that race is a particular thing. Whatever historical epoch that I'm writing about, race is the conventional understanding of that epoch. And so I'm writing about it in the way that people are thinking about it in that particular time. Now, you mentioned Jefferson and the Jefferson-Hemings controversy. I spend a bit of time in my book talking about the Jefferson-Hemings controversy and making it clear that, in my view, it shouldn't be actually all that controversial. It seems so evident. Even before this DNA, by the way, the DNA investigation with respect to Jefferson and Hemings doesn't prove conclusively that Jefferson was had a sexual relationship with Hemings. It's just that the DNA is consistent with that interpretation. In my view, it's quite clear that they had a sexual relationship, and one wouldn't need DNA to know that. The thing that I think is so striking, and there's still people, and some people whom I respect, some quite distinguished people who are still very resistant and say, well, it's still unclear, it's still unproven. And one thing that strikes me is, I want to ask this of some of the historians who say this, well, it's true, it's not altogether, it's not conclusively proven, but let me ask you this. No one asks for conclusive proof that Thomas Jefferson was the biological father of the Jefferson children. Now, we all know that within marriages, in fact, people have done investigations about this. There's an appreciable number of instances where, somebody has actually stepped outside of the marital relationship. It could have been that Thomas Jefferson's wife was having an affair. It's unlikely from all that we know, but it's not conclusive, but nobody asked that. The evidence points toward the idea, the conclusion that he's the biological father, and people accept it. But with respect to this, there has to be a level of proof that is beyond any sort of level that's ever asked. And so I spend my time going through the evidence, which it seems to me, again, is pretty clear-cut, and investigating why has this been such a sticking point over the years. After all, it's well known, it's thoroughly well known that there were many sexual relations between masters and slaves. Thomas Jefferson knew this very much and wrote about it. And so it says something about the resistance in our society, the anxiety in our society about interracial intimacy, that there has been just this die-hard, no, it couldn't be attitude towards the Jefferson Hemings relationship. Others?
Yes, I think your idea about studying these relationships between the races at our jobs and in social environments is very interesting. But with our society as separate from a social standpoint, I have a lot of white friends, but we don't go to entertainment, the same type of entertainment events. We don't go to church together. We're not interested in the same types of music a lot of times. How would you study something like that with so much separation between the cultures? There are like definite cultures. There is a thing as black culture. And if you're not a part of that racial makeup, if you're a white person, there are a lot of white people who know a lot about black culture, but by and large in this country, those whites are few and far between. So how would you do that?
Two things. First, I think that actually there's a lot more overlap and integration at the cultural level than one would think. Think about jazz. I think of my great, one of my heroes, Louis Armstrong. Now, Louis Armstrong is, the music of Louis Armstrong, he's playing a horn. Where'd that horn come from? I mean, he's clearly making use of instruments and traditions that trace their lineage in part to Europe. He's also obviously playing music that traces its lineage to Africa. American history is, to an extraordinary degree, a melange. You go to an all-white Baptist church and listen to people sing. It might be an all-white Baptist church, but the African-American influence is definitely there. So I think at one level there's actually been considerably more interrelationship. You take a look, just take a look around this room at the way we look, the physiognomy, the skin color, shape of noses, shape of lips. I mean, there's obviously been more interaction. As for the separateness, and you're right, there is separateness. Separateness, as far as I'm concerned, is extremely important. When my students gave me a really tough time in the classes after I talked about dating and the singles ads. There were some students who said, gosh, come on, Professor Kennedy, that's trivial. That's trivial, this thing about, dating. And I said, well, is it trivial? Just a couple of weeks prior to then, we had been talking about race relations and the administration of criminal justice. More particularly, we had been talking about the administration of capital punishment. More particularly, we had been talking about the administration of capital punishment in Georgia, McCleskey versus Kemp, the leading case dealing with racial discrimination or allegations of racial discrimination in the administration of capital punishment. When we talked about it, one theory for why it is, at least for a long time, and it probably is still the case in Georgia, that you're much more likely to be sentenced to death if you kill a white person than if you kill a black person. One theory for that was the criminal justice system, the people that run the criminal justice system, have a lot more empathy, a lot more sympathy, a lot more sort of close feeling at the victimization of a white person. Now, if that is true, if it is true that the administration of capital punishment and the administration of criminal justice in general is affected by things like sympathy, empathy, identifying with someone. You have in front of you a family that's been victimized. You're a prosecutor. You feel for them. What's dating about? What's friendship about? What is, marrying about, other than sympathy, empathy, the marketplace of emotion? To the extent that people feel as though they can't empathize with another, they can't fully step in another's shoes, to the extent to which we feel that other of our fellows are, over there, it's that group, and then there's them, and then there's us. To that extent, those feelings are going to percolate into every aspect of our society, whether it's the administration of criminal justice, whether it's our housing patterns, whether it's our employment patterns. In that sense, it seems to me that the question of dating, the question of marriage, is extremely important. If for no other reason, then it shows us the degree to which we remain divided, and that feeling of division is definitely going to show itself in lots of different ways.
Hi. I just wanted to say that I'm very familiar with the Loving case. It's funny you should mention that. I recall that from law school. We talked about it in depth in family law, so that was interesting that you visited that particular case tonight. And then I want to say that I do not have an issue with one who chooses to date someone outside their race by happenstance. You're downtown and you bump into somebody in a corner and you all fall in love and he or she happens to be African American or white. But I do have an issue with those African Americans, particularly male African Americans who reach a certain station in life and then choose only to date Caucasian women, or either vice versa, however you want to do it. It seems like it's a categorical prerequisite that their significant others be the trophy, blonde hair, wife. I have an issue with that. And then you said that you feel that America is multicultural. I don't think that America is quite yet. By way of Tiger Woods, he wins the Masters. You would have thought that he would have assimilated. It seems, from outward appearances that he had assimilated into the majority culture, but he wins the Masters, and then they talk about collard greens and fried chicken at the dinner. But then he chooses to date whomever he chooses to date. And then secondly, and lastly, Halle Berry is obviously, she said she's interracial. Her father is African American, her mother is Caucasian. But she said her mom made it clear to her in no uncertain terms that she would be considered African American in this culture. So I think America has a long way to go before we can by far consider ourselves multicultural. So.
Okay, well, when I said America is multicultural, what I meant to say, as a matter of fact it is, a lot of people are ignorant or repress the facts or try to ignore the facts. And indeed, we do have a lot more, there needs to be a very concerted effort waged against the ignorance that still pervades American life. Let me say two things. On this question of Loving versus Virginia, I make it clear in my book, actually, that though Loving versus Virginia is undoubtedly the most famous single case, I think that the Supreme Court actually gets far too much applause for Loving versus Virginia. After all, Loving versus Virginia was decided in 1967. That's at the end of the Civil Rights Revolution. Not in 1954. Brown versus Board of Education came in 1954. The Supreme Court had a chance in 1955 to confront this issue of interracial marriage, state prohibitions on interracial marriage. And the justices ducked the issue, and we now know that the justices ducked the issue because they thought that it was just too hot of an issue to handle. And they waited until they thought that the society would be willing to countenance a ruling striking down, finally, laws prohibiting interracial marriage. A court that I think is entitled to far more applause is the Supreme Court of California, because 19 years before Loving versus Virginia, the California Supreme Court, in a case called Perez versus Sharp, which, by the way, involved a black man and a Latino woman but though the woman was Latino, they counted her as white. California law forbade interracial marriage, and the California Supreme Court in 1948 struck down California law. This was way before the Supreme Court. Now let's get to your middle comment, though, and your middle comment is one that my book's been out about 6 weeks, and your middle comment is the one that thus far has provoked the most heated discussion. And so let me say a little bit about it. First, I should say, let me start off by saying what I'm for. What ultimately am I for? I am ultimately in the love camp. I'm in the love camp. I'm in the friendship camp. I'm in the affection camp. I think that people should be able to express without embarrassment, without fear, without inhibition, healthy adult desires for friendship, for love, for affection, wherever they find them, including over the race line. So anything that stands in the way of the display of such feelings of affection, anything that stands in the way of that, I'm against. Now, does that mean that I'm saying that every interracial relationship is healthy? Absolutely not. There is, our society, we are the inheritors of a pigmentocracy. Racial prejudice is all around us, and it shows up in various ways. Sometimes, oftentimes, it shows up in efforts to keep people apart. Can it also show up in the midst of an interracial relationship? Sure it can. Sure it can. I talk, for instance, about the first black heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson, by the way, is just like the sort of black man that you described. Jack Johnson married white women. He married them. He was asked about why he wanted them. He said he preferred white women, made him feel better. And some of that, and he's not alone. One could mention others. And my sense is that some of that is the internalization of, sometimes it's the internalization of just pure anti-black attitudes. Black people can be prejudiced against black people too. It's also sometimes the internalization of our society's privileging of whiteness. Blondes have more fun. It's only recently, it's just the day before yesterday that black women were even allowed in beauty contests with white women. And more recent still, since black women had any hope of being viewed as beautiful, glamorous. Think about it. Hollywood, until fairly recently, the black woman's role was made with bandana on. The idea of the black woman as the sort of the showstopper, the femme fatale, that wasn't even part of imagination. So, and of course, this has had an effect. It's had an effect not only on whites, it's had an effect on black people too. It's had an effect on some black men who think that that white women are the acme of pulchritude and of all that's wonderful in womanhood. And of course, that's too bad, that's unfortunate. That's not all that's going on. There are many, many, many interracial relationships which are wonderful relationships. And that needs to be underlined because throughout our history, people who have been involved in interracial relationships have been accused of being neurotic, have been accused of being lunatics. And I use the word lunatic advisedly. In my book, I give instance after instance after instance of people who have been consigned to insane asylums because they were in interracial relationships. Because, after all, what could be a better sign of lunacy than for a white person to be involved with a black person? What other evidence do you need that the person is crazy? So, that's a long-winded way of saying it's a complicated situation, and one has to look at it from all different sides.
I'm in high school right now, and most of my friends are multicultural. And one girl in particular, she's half white, half Hispanic, and half black. And right now it's cool to be black in our school, and she won't accept half of her race. So she only admits that she's black, and she doesn't accept the other half of her. So do you think many people are not accepting half of their heritage?
I don't know, but my view of this person would be more power to her. If she wants to say that she's black, that's fine. In my view, frankly, and but by the same token, if she wanted to say she was white, that'd be fine with me too. Now, this has occasioned controversy. There was a case of a politician in California he was the mayor of a town, and he held himself out as black. Another politician did an investigation of this fella and found that his parents were white. And this other politician outed, it's true, the guy, and there was a recall and he was recalled. I mean, my own view of this is this fellow wanted to identify himself as a black person, and fine. If he wanted to identify himself as a black person, I don't see any reason why he shouldn't, so long as he is in good faith identifying himself as a black person. Let me give you a story from my neck of the woods, Massachusetts. Occurred a couple of years ago. Two brothers sought a position in the Boston Fire Department. They apply for these positions and they don't get a job. A year goes by, they reapply. When they reapply, they indicate that they are black. Boston, of course, has had a long history of racial discrimination against black people. It was under a court order to hire more black firefighters. These guys, the second time around, are hired. Years go by, and one of the brothers seeks a higher position. He wants to be a captain or something. At this point, someone writes an anonymous letter to the authorities, and they say, listen, this is ridiculous. These two guys are white. And there's an investigation. They are discharged. They sue to get their jobs back. There is a hearing. They bring to their hearing a picture of their grandmother. Now, I didn't see the picture, but apparently nobody could tell anything from this old picture. They're asked the following question: the first time you applied for the job, why didn't you say the first time you applied for the job that you were black? And they said, well, we didn't know about our grandmother then. There was a judge, a single justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, had to decide this case. And the judge did, I think, a very interesting thing. The judge said, I'm not going to ask the question whether these guys are black or white, because I'm not going to go back, I'm not going to put a pencil through their hair and see if the pencil sticks. I'm not going to, get some calipers out and examine their lips, their nose, or any of that business. Rather, I'm going to ask, did they themselves consider themselves honestly to be black? And if they considered themselves to be black, that's an end to it. They're black. He held a hearing, and he said, these guys do not consider themselves to be black. The only time they consider themselves to be black is for purposes of getting this benefit. They are engaged in fraud. Now, I thought that was a really interesting way of handling it. The judge was essentially saying people can determine for themselves what they want to be. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that's a good way to go about things.
Okay, this will be our last question.
I just had a comment. Do you think that interracial couples, and especially if it's a black man or a black woman, or really anyone who really is like self-hating themselves, what they are, their race, they marry into another race, can they really prepare the children out of that union to come into the world and be proud of both their sides? That's really the best opportunity to prepare them and to help promote a multicultural society. But that's one part of my statement, but also the other. For people who come to this country, particularly I have some Asian friends who really want very much to just fit into American culture, so they deny everything that they have come from, their culture and everything, just to fit in. How do we, in this society where we have the best opportunity to really promote multicultural society and world, we are the worst at really promoting that. We're the worst at making that an important thing for us to celebrate who we are and all the cultures that exist in this country. Mm-hmm. How do we, can we do that when we have such problems with, yes, I'm this, celebrating who I am, try to learn and accept, because we do have the best opportunity, but we waste it so very much in this country.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you on your last point. It's always a question of compared to what. And from what I gather in the United States, actually, one of the striking features of the United States is actually the extraordinary extent to which there are many, many, many expressions of communal self-assertion. If you think about all the various sort of self-help, self-protective organizations, groups, societies, I would bet that, at least in comparison with other nation states around the world, the United States is actually more attentive and more accepting of all variety of difference than other societies. On the question of denial, again, I think one has to be careful about that. I mean, on the one hand, I think people have to be accepting of the desire of people to deny. I mean, after all, you think about one of the stock characters in American democracy is the immigrant. The immigrant who leaves the old country, leaves everything behind, comes to these shores, and recreates himself or herself. Now, is there a loss in that? Well, perhaps. Is there something heroic in that? Perhaps. I mean, I would allow people to do what they want to do. If a person actually wants to hold on to, old language, old ties, old traditions, etc., fine. For the person, however, who says, I want to be deracinated. I don't want to hold on to the old ways. I want to come to a new place and remake myself. My view is that's fine too. And we oughtn't actually demand any particular way of being. I think one of the great glories of American society is actually its openness, its fluidity. The openness for people to be imaginative in determining how they conceive of themselves. And I think as a society, it's to our collective betterment to allow as much space as we can muster for people to define themselves as they like, and most of all, for people to love and find affection and community in ways that they see fit. You've been a very fine audience. Thank you very much.
Randall Kennedy is author of Interracial Intimacies, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption. It's published by Pantheon Books on the web at pantheonbooks.com.
You're watching 48 Hours.